In the first video, I talked about my early experience of artificial intelligence and the idea that things like love, beauty, poetry, they're meaningless unless you can describe them so precisely that a computer could replicate them. I also talked about the scientific idea of reductionism, which says things like love, well, that's just activity in the brain or hormones in the body, and so on. Described, apparently dismissing spiritual experience and some of our most amazing emotional experiences as just certain physical phenomena. And I pointed out, although that was, on one level, that was depressing because it sort of made them trivial. On the other hand, it countered the artificial intelligence argument that if you couldn't describe them accurately enough to program them, they're meaningless. Because if love is certain chemical reactions in the body, it has a physical basis, and you can't say it's meaningless. It is something real, even if it's something rather boringly real. And then I went on from there to talk about reversing reductionism. I only just touched on virtual reality because it wasn't a big issue for me in the 60s. It's true that we talked about the idea that a box, some form of computer of the future, could contain a human consciousness. It could contain my mind. But it was clear to me that it wasn't really me, because I can move around. I can touch this screen, I can touch the keyboard, I can walk around this room. And it wouldn't really be me unless we'd somehow given this box hands and feet and sensory apparatus that it could experience its environment the way I do. And that produced the idea, well, perhaps we could, if we could simulate the intelligence, we could simulate that environment too. We could create a room that was part of that virtual reality. Now, I wasn't very excited about that because I could see it was a hell of a lot of work for not much result. You see, if you're going to create a virtual reality like that, sort of build it for an environment, you're going to have to do it bloody well. You see, it's not like a movie where you can just aim the camera shots, so that, like those traditional cowboy street scenes where the facades are all just boards stuck up, and nothing behind them. If this was a reality that I could explore, if you have a pot plant on the table, it has to be very good because I could get a magnifying glass and I could look at it in detail. If you have a light switch on the wall and it doesn't work because you haven't programmed it to work, I'd click it and I'd think there's something wrong here. I might even take out a screwdriver, unscrew it, and I'd expect to see cables behind and so on and forth. So all that effort, I thought, well, it doesn't really interest me very much. It wasn't until 10 years later, really, in 1980 roundabout, that I took a new look at the idea of virtual reality from a very different angle. It was a response to two things that were busy in the media at that time. One of them was people like von Daniken were writing about the idea that this planet had been visited in the past by intelligent aliens. This was taken as a reason why in monuments like Stonehenge there are signs of extraordinary sort of mathematical and engineering skills which go way beyond what people might expect of what were meant to be ignorant, uneducated savages in Neolithic times. And therefore, maybe an intelligence had visited. Now, I'm not really into these sort of, piling up evidence things because always someone else comes along and says, oh no, they've got their facts wrong, and like that. But I'm interested in the idea of that. I'm always interested in these ideas. The other big thing that was around at the time in the news in a big way was something rather depressing. It was the idea of overpopulation. What would happen to this world if we just kept on breeding and a population going up and up and up? How would we cope? And the answer was, first of all, nature would have to go. You can't have oceans and forests and things with all those people to house. The whole world would have to become one giant city. And the only way that city could grow would be outwards or upwards. And people then would really be reduced to living in little apartments within this mighty sphere and recycling everything, their bodies and everything for food, and mining materials to create more food artificially. And even that scenario had its limits. As the scientists were pointing out, they said that the heat generated by these living things would have to be dispersed out into space. The surface of this great city would have to glow like the sun, giving off heat. And there's a limit to how far that could go, because the volume inside increases at the cube of the radius, whereas the surface increases as a square. So that, for me, was an absolute nightmare. I was brought up in the Cotswolds, in the country, not another house in sight, sunbathing in the nude, walking in wet grass and all that. The thought of living in these little apartments was horrible. So I thought to myself, how could anyone survive that? And I had the idea which I called cyber, what do I call the bloody things? Recreational cyberneticians. That basically the only way people would survive a thing like that, not go mad, would be to spend most of their life, like cats, asleep. And they would have helmets on their heads which would sort of read their brain patterns, and the recreational cyberneticians would create for everyone dreams according to their nature. Very vivid dreams where they could play rugby, swim in the ocean, they could explore deserts or whatever, and spend most of their lives doing that and just wake up for a few hours for food and to earn a living. Now, you see, even that world will reach its limits. So I wrote this short story where we were approaching those limits, and what can the world do? And remember, in those days, it wasn't so realistic to talk about terraforming other planets and that. We didn't have Mars rover and all that stuff. So the governments realised that it was just too late to start really shipping people off, because there were so many billions of people that that wasn't the option. And the only suggestion that looked at all possible was the recreational cyberneticians said, we've been creating worlds for people to live in. We now have the processing power that we could create 1 million parallel worlds, and we could download people's consciousness into these worlds and spread them out. And of course, this was debated by the religious people, scientific people, and the politicians, saying, oh, well, the new world, we must make sure there's no crime, and we'll make sure everyone is very worthy, and this, that, and the other. And the recreational cyberneticians said, forget it. This is much too complex to fiddle around in that sort of way. The only really realistic thing we could do is to recreate the world as it was. And we suggest that the best option is to recreate the world at the time when civilization, the very birth of human civilization. To go back earlier would be too cruel. Later, it could get a bit too complicated. And so that's what they did. They created 1 million worlds like the Neolithic times, and people's brains, consciousness began to download into those worlds, and they started to live in them. And the last person to go down was the man who'd thought up this scheme. So he took his kill the body tablet, he put on his helmet, and he came round in the body of a tribal sage, an old man sitting on a lovely plain, and there were children running round. And something which, of course, logically he knew, but he hadn't really got into, was the thought that, oh my God, these children, they've been born in this world. And my world, the real world, is, to them, it's just a myth. And it'll become a myth. People might not even believe it ever existed. And he was so disturbed by that, he thought, well, no, I must do something for future generations. I know, I'll write something down. No, nothing that you write is going to last for tens of thousands of years until, until people know enough to understand it. Carve it on stone, no. He thought the only thing I can do to sort of send a message to future civilizations is to build some great massive stone structure and sort of leave that as a message. And of course, that was how I left my story, because it suggested that something like Stonehenge had been built by someone like that. And this was the world we're living in. Yeah. Now, I like that, because whereas von Daniken, the trouble with von Daniken's idea was that there wasn't enough evidence of these beings from outer space. Now, I know that just like now, they would probably do their very best not to contaminate the planet they landed on. But it's hard to believe that there wouldn't be just a few nuts and bolts from their spaceships or whatever lying around, or some bits of stuff that would be found. Whereas in my version, you didn't need anything like that, because it was only the minds that came down, nothing physical. So I was very pleased with that. But it was not another 10 years passed, from 1770 to 1980, before I really sort of looked into that idea again. And this time I approached it from a different angle. People were beginning to talk about the sort of the theory of everything that they were looking for. In other words, physical equations which describe the laws of physics, which would sum up all the processes which not only created this world but sustained it. And people were saying things like, is it extraordinary that, I know, Planck's constant or something has to be very exactly a certain value, otherwise the universe wouldn't work, it would just explode or give up or something. Questions like that. And I thought to myself, if they came up with these equations, how would they test them? Now, there's no way they could dig up enough matter to make another universe and try it out. What you would have to do would be to run it as a simulation in a big computer. Computers were getting quite good by 1980. So that is what I thought would happen. Now, what you do is you put in all these equations and you put in some initial conditions. My first thought might be like, a random scattering of hydrogen atoms throughout space, and then sort of let them come in and see if a Big Bang happened. And if it happened, did planets form, solar systems and planets form as we expect? And you would watch all that. And you would say, yippee, it works. But you couldn't really get away with that, because there would be people, religious people, saying, yes, you've made matter, but you haven't made life. That needs God. And so you would have to leave the thing running until some planets emerged, a bit Earth-like, and life appeared on them. Yippee, we've done it. No. Remember, we are made in God's image. You haven't shown intelligent life. And so you would have to leave it running until intelligent life emerged. And in fact, how do you know it's intelligent life rather than just a clever simulation? You'd really have to leave it running until it caught up with our level of understanding. And the beings in that world themselves worked out the theory of everything and decided to simulate it in one of their computers and create another world, and so on. So, thinking of this, I expressed it as a paradox, which I called Johnston's paradox. And basically the paradox is, if the world is, as the physicists describe it, a material universe of atoms and molecules obeying a set of rules, then it is extremely unlikely that we're living in that world. Because a world like that would generate a limitless number of virtual worlds, as all the different civilizations tried out their equations. And so that was the paradox. Now at the time I extended it also with ideas that they might play around with variations in those worlds and create different sort of models, and some of them might be magical ones and so on. But that wasn't really the relevant thing. Johnston's paradox was about the fact that we are not just that, as in the first story I gave you, that there is a possibility one might create a virtual universe as a solution to a problem, but actually it's almost inevitable that we are living in a virtual world, a much stronger suggestion. And that was the idea I put forward. In around I had it around 1980, and then I wrote it into an article in a magazine called Aquarian Arrow. And then later, in 1986, I wrote it up, a fuller version of that, in a book called Words Made Flesh. Now, what had happened in those years is that I realized it was hard to get people really to take an interest. The words virtual reality hadn't been formed yet. So I was talking about computer simulations or models of the universe, something like that. And it wasn't really catching on except amongst a few of the Chaos and Magic fraternity. And so I took a different approach, or I added a different approach when I wrote Words Made Flesh, which was to say, look, even if this isn't virtual reality, I think it's going to become almost necessary to believe that it is. And the argument I put was a sort of like Occam's razor, that the mind doesn't like to have too many parallel explanations for the same thing. And that's why it doesn't always happen, but if, say, you have had wonderful spiritual experiences, and then someone comes along and says, that's just chemicals in the brain, and I can prove it by giving you LSD or something, and you will have a similar spiritual experience. And you try it, and what you thought was God speaking to you, you get exactly the same thing happening when you take LSD. Now, when things like that happen, or when science produces an explanation of the creation of the world and evolution, which doesn't need God, for a lot of people, they can no longer believe in God or a spiritual experience, because they don't really want to carry two versions of the same thing in their mind, the one made by God and the one made by science. They'll say, well, the science one has been demonstrated to me, and so I don't believe in God anymore. Now, what I proposed was that as people began to develop better and better virtual realities, and people experienced them, I was still talking not in terms of virtual reality, but in terms of modeling the universe, and people with headsets, experiencing and moving through these worlds, that type of thing. As they got better and better, people would begin to say to themselves, this type of reality has been demonstrated to me. I see how it works, and I see that I can experience it. Now, someone is trying to tell me that actually there's another type of reality that we live in, made out of atoms and molecules and matter and all that. But if I can't tell the difference, between them, I think that both of them will be virtual reality. In other words, I don't need a physical world now that I'm beginning to experience a virtual reality and I know how real it is. And so that was an argument that I added for words made flesh. And then I looked at what the implications would be for magic, for religion, for society, and for science, and so on, if that idea became prevalent. So that's how my ideas of virtual reality, what we now call virtual reality, emerged. Now there's a number of different ways you can go from that. You see, I've gone from, go back to the thing, the brain in the box, a world that you sort of make deliberately, like a film director might, building in all the elements to create a reality. And I'm not keen on that one. Then there's the one where you build a sort of model of the world as it was and then let it run. That let it run is important because in the third version you actually just completely let it run. Put in those equations, those scientific equations, and you don't want to tamper with it now because the whole point is to see if the scientific equations work, and so you let it run and you do the minimum of intervention. Next time I'd like to talk about some of the ways one might intervene, some variations on this theme.